Here are my tips and tricks for you to dominate your fantasy football league draft. First up, I have develop your list of sleepers by position. These are players that you'd be comfortable drafting in the later rounds, like maybe the 9th round or later, that you think can still be a top performing player at their position. This doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be drafting these players no matter what, but they become good options if I were to miss out on some of the top tier talent at each position. So for example, if I were to miss out on the top tier QBs like, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts type players, I would be comfortable waiting to draft a guy like Dak Prescott as my QB1 in the 12th round. If I were to miss out on the top tight end, I can then use my sleeper list to find value in the 11th round or later and draft a player like Tucker Kraft. I recommend making a list of 3 to 4 players at each position that you have as sleeper picks that can drastically outperform their ADP. And this will give you a lot of flexibility to move around in the draft and move as the draft board evolves. My next tip is don't worry about bye weeks. So every year someone in the draft mentions, wait, 3 of my players have the same bye week, and then suddenly they're passing on players they would have drafted just to balance out their buys. And so, fantasy football is a weekly game, right? So, drafting players with all the same buys may cause, one tough week in your season, but championships are won with season-long value. If you pass on a top-tier player just because of a bye conflict, you're sacrificing that talent that may win you that championship for a single week of convenience. And then even if you do draft a large number of players with the same bye week, your team will most likely change by then. Typically active leagues have a lot of trades, and you'll be making waiver wire pickups throughout the year that by the time you actually get to those bye weeks, your team may look completely different. So next time you draft, focus on talent, opportunity, and upside, and not necessarily the bye week calendar. My next tip is going to be avoiding one of the biggest traps in the draft, the dreaded positional run. Everybody's seen this happen. Maybe one tight end goes off the board, then another, and then suddenly everybody's panicking, and we have maybe 5 or 6 tight ends flying off the board in one round. It creates panic, and that leads to bad picks. When you chase a run like that, you're drafting out of fear and not out of the value that's on the board. You end up reaching for a player that you didn't want just because others are doing it, and then that's how you end up with maybe like a tight end 8 in the 5th round when you could have had a really good running back or a really good wide receiver with way more upside. Use your draft board as a compass. If the value's not there, pivot to a different position. Let others reach while you scoop up that falling talent. And then you can always pick up a sleeper in the later rounds at the overdrafted positions. Next up, we have wait until the last 2 rounds of your draft to pick kickers in a defense. So every year you see someone draft a kicker or defense maybe in the 9th or 10th round, it usually never works out well. Defenses and kickers year to year are very unpredictable positions in fantasy. You might see, somebody drop 15 points on defense one week, and the next week, they're barely breaking 3 or 4 points. So why would you really want to spend, one of your mid-round picks on that kind of volatility? Drafting a kicker defense in, the 9th, 12th rounds means you're passing on a high upside player. So this could be potentially a rookie or a sleeper breakout wide receiver or a backup running back that could potentially win your league. And that's a huge cost for positions that you'll likely stream week to week anyways. So for me, I usually like to stream defenses based off matchup, and I sometimes do that for kickers as well. So I'll typically stream a new defense and potentially a kicker week to week. So what I do is usually with the last 2 picks, I grab a defense and a kicker that has a really good week 1 matchup. And so if they don't do well, it's not too big of an issue. You're not married to them for the rest of the season because you spent a very high draft pick on them, and you can then get a different defense the next week. And then meanwhile, you have all those high upside players that you took in the 10th or 12th round instead of taking those defenses that's available for your team. Another overlooked aspect to dominating your draft is knowing what your league settings are. It may seem simple, but it's not just about picking the players, right? It's about picking the right players for your format. The settings that you have in your league can shape everything, including like the scoring, the roster size, and then you have to take that into account for your draft strategy. Are you in a PPR league, a super flex, a dynasty? Each different format's going to change the way that we value players. In a PPR league, for example, pass catching running backs and slot receivers, become higher in value. In standard scoring, you may want those guys that get a lot of goal line work for extra touchdowns and yardage. If you don't know the format, you're really going to the draft blind. Especially settings like return yards can vault players like Rashid Shaheed up the draft boards, and those may not be captured in normal ranking lists that you may find online. So take advantage of your league settings to draft those high quality players. Have any other good draft tips? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.